Welcome back to Notion to Sew, a channel that's all about reviewing sewing notions, books, and a little life encouragement. So now we have reached the second video on my quest to perfect fitting jeans. And I had a moment of self-reflection. I just thought to myself, why am I doing this? Of all the problems in the world today, why has it become my priority to make jeans that fit? And what made me really think about this was a sermon that I heard this morning. My pastor told me that when we get comfortable with things, we can grow dissatisfied. Now, I have been sewing and making clothes for just me for years, never really sharing what I learned. And I'm an introvert. A great day for me is spending hours on my own. Now, what brings me back to the point about making jeans that fit? Yes, I am pushing my skills and abilities sewing wise, but this channel is for you. You can't be in here crying. I'm sharing what I learned so that we can grow together, so that you too can push past what is comfortable, so that you can reach into that part of yourself that has gotten discontented with your routine. So today, making jeans that fit is what is getting me out of my comfort zone. And my prayer is that this example will inspire you to take a look at the areas in your life where you are growing dissatisfied, areas where you can rise up and stand for what's important. So please keep this in mind as you watch me tackle this monumental task of making jeans that fit. And I hope you enjoy this week's video.
Okay, so this is the pattern that I'm going to be using. This is the Anna Allen Philippa pants. They are just a straight leg pant, no stretch, and they're a little short here. Well, this is a style I want to wear. I don't know if it's really in style, probably not, but these are the style jeans that I think would look most flattering on me. So I decided just to walk through all the steps that I'm going to take to alter the pattern. And again, this will kind of turn into a book review almost. This is the book that I'm using, the Fitting and Pattern Alteration book by Lake D. Raspin and Potberg Steinekart. I got this on Amazon. No, I got this at Barnes & Noble's. It's kind of an expensive book, but this class that I went to a couple of years ago, the instructor highly recommended it. And as I was doing research and reading this book to get a better understanding, I did not see, or at least from my really quick look through a Google search, I didn't see anyone that even walked you through how to do this, aside from the class that I took. So I don't know how popular this method is. All I know is it makes a lot of sense to me. And there's still some things that I'm confused about. So that's why I decided I'm just going to walk you through every single thing that it tells me to do. So the first step is it tells you the order that you need to measure measure yourself and measure the pattern. So that's what I'm going to do for this video, is just walk you through how I did it step by step. So the first thing I did was I made this chart, and I've got my measurements and then the pattern measurements. The first measurement that they tell you to take is your inseam, which mine is 33 3/4. All my measurements are going to be in inches. And so the next thing that you do is, this is my cutting board, and you measure from the bottom of the board and then plot out what your inseam is. So I started again from the bottom, measured 33 1/4 inches up, and then I put this piece of tape here. And so that idea is, if you can think about your pants, so right now this becomes the floor, right? If I'm laying my pants out, this would become the floor. So what I'm going to do is take my pattern piece and put my crotch, or the crotch on the pants, right at 33 1/4 inches where my inseam is. And as you can see, these are the pants, this is the floor, so these pants are a little bit short. Well, they're going to be short on me, which is okay because I don't want them to go to the floor. These pants have like a little cuff at the bottom, so they're going to be a little bit short, which is by design. That's the style that I'm going for. All right, so just to show you, I measured the inseam for the pants, and I just used my tape measure and just walked it down to measure it. But the inseam is 32.5 minus the 1/2 inch seam allowance minus the 2.5 inch hem. I read that from the pattern instructions. So the inseam is actually 29.5. So that's a bit of a difference. I don't know. I think that should be okay. Okay, so the next measurement that I have to take is my hip level, and my hip level is at the joint. So right at your hip joint, you're going to measure from that all the way to the floor. So for me, to the best of my ability, I think my hip level at joint is 37.5. So what you're going to do, again, using this end of my board is the floor, I measured 37.5 inches all the way up and then drew this purple line. So this purple line is where my hip bone is. So the next measurement I need to take is the crotch depth. And the crotch depth is the side seam minus the inseam. So again, I use the measuring tape on the pattern to measure the side seam. I got 43.5 minus the 1/2 inch seam allowance minus the 2.5 inch hem. So that came to 40.5. So 40.5 minus our inseam measurement, which is 29.5. So we have an 11 inch crotch depth. Okay, so now that I have the pattern crotch depth, which is 11, I can then take a look and see what this section is my measurements, and I can see what my crotch depth is. So I know that my measurement from my waist to the floor at my side seam is 45 inches. My inseam, as we said before, is 33 3/4 inches. So that gives me a crotch depth of 11 and a inch, which, as you can see, is pretty close to the pattern. So I'm not going to make any changes to that either. But I did want to just add here that if I did need to make a change in my crotch depth, I would need to cut the pattern right here and either add a piece or fold it over and subtract a piece. So that's where I would make that adjustment. So next, I need to measure the crotch length of the pants. Now still, we're working on the front piece. So the crotch length is from the end all the way to the waist. Measure all the way up. So I did that, and on the pattern piece, it's 11 3/8. And on the pattern piece itself, it does say that there's a 3/8 in seam allowance at the front fly and front crotch curve. So I subtracted the 3/8, so that gives me a crotch length of 11. And I measured my own crotch length. Now this again is from the inseam to the waist, which is 11. another way I reconfirmed that this is my the shape of my crotch curve. I measured from my front waist all the way down to the inseam, and it is 11. So luckily, I don't have to make any changes to this either. But the way I would, in case I needed to, if I needed to make any changes, that's how I could make some cuts, not going through the seam line, but right at the seam line to make this longer or shorter if I needed to. Okay, so I did the same length measurement on the back. So my measurement, the inseam is still the same. I measured the pattern piece inseam, which is still the same as the front. And then I also did the crotch depth measurement. So the side seam minus the inseam is still 11. My crotch depth is 11 1/4, so I'm not going to make any changes. And then with the crotch length, again, I just used the measuring tape, measured all along the length right here. So the length came to 16 1/2 minus the ½ inch seam allowance, that came to 16. And then my crotch length, that I can just measure on myself from my back waist to my crotch, that is also 16. So ironically, I don't have to make any changes in any of the length measurements for this pattern. Okay, so after we do the length measurements, then we do the width measurements. And the idea is that you start from the top and you work your way down. So you start with the waist, the high hip, the hip level at joint, then the low hip at the crotch level. And so what I did was I measured the pattern piece, factoring in the seam allowance and then factoring in the wearing ease, because the pattern instructions, they do tell me what the finished garment measurements are. So for the waist, I had 20 1/4 minus 1 1 1/8. I got 19 1/8. So I did that for each of the 4 measurements. And then that's for the pattern, and this is for the front piece. Then for me, I measured my front measurements, and the only difference was in here, the pattern is 19 1/8 in the waist, and I am 18 in the waist. This is just the front. So that's a difference of 1 1/8. All of the rest of the measurements were the same pretty much, so I'm not going to make any changes. I just need to make my waist 1 1/8 inch smaller. Now the front piece of this pattern, as you can see, does not have a dart. So what I'm going to do is just sew the side seams at the waist 1 inch, and then flare back out to a ½ inch once I get to the high hip measurement. So hopefully that will account for the 1 1/8 difference. Okay, so I did the same width measurements for the back pattern piece, and there is a pretty significant difference between me and the pattern. So these are all the measurements for the pattern piece. Now again, I have subtracted the seam allowance and the wearing ease, and I got these numbers here. But when I measure myself, the waist is 7/8 bigger, so I need to subtract 7/8. But then the high hip, I am 1 1/8 bigger than the pattern piece, so I need to add. And then for the hip and the low hip, there's a difference of like 3 inches, and the low hip, it's 5 1/2 inches difference. Now there could definitely be some error in my measuring, but I think this just shows that lower I don't have as much junk in my trunk as the pattern, so I'm gonna have to account for that, so then I won't have like saggy fabric in the back. So I'm gonna have to figure out how I can subtract that from the pattern piece and also add it for the high hip. So when you are making width adjustments, you start from the top and you work your way down. So for the waist, I need to take out 7/8. So if you remember, I'm already going to be giving an inch seam allowance for the waist because the waist in the front is big too. So I'm already going to be taking off an inch here and then going back out to the 1/2 inch seam allowance. I can also adjust the width of the dart if I need to, but I think I'm just going to sew the dart the way that it's shown here, and if I need to, I can let out the dart a little bit. But I need to add more room in the high hip. So according to my trusty book here, this is how I can add some more room here. So I'm using the seam method. Now there's lots of different methods that you can use for adjusting, but I'm going to be doing the seam method. So what I'm going to do is make these cuts exactly here, the way it's shown, and then add the amount that I need for my high hip area. The instructions tell me to cut here to the seam line, and I've marked the seam line here. So what I'm doing is making a cut here, and then I'm going to cut all along the seam line. And then I'll cut a little ways here. So the next thing I'll have to do is cut right here, not through, but to here. So as you can see, I didn't cut through, but now I've got a hinge, so I can move this the way that I need to. And I'm going to cut a couple more of these same hinges. So I'm not cutting through, I'm just cutting like right to the end so it makes a hinge. I'll make one more down here. And then I have to do one at the top. Okay, so now I've got these hinges. If you can see, they're all hinges, and I can move the pattern piece to give me the space that I need. Okay, so this is where I ended up. I put the pink paper to show how much I added. I know that when you're manipulating this, it needs to stay flat, so this is how much I was able to add and still make sure that the pattern pieces stayed flat. So I think this is going to be the most challenging part. According to my measurements, this is the back pattern piece. I fixed the high hip. I needed more room in the high hip, but my hips are a lot more narrow than the pattern piece. So what I did was I cut and released. This is the side seam. So according to the instructions in the book, I'm just supposed to, well, let me just show you. It's hinged right here at the top, so I have some movement here. So according to the instructions, I'm just supposed to move it in um, to make it more narrow in the hip area. But the thing is, I want to still keep the grain lines the same and the shape the same. That's the real challenge. So if I move it in too much, it's going to distort the shape, and that's not going to help me. So I'm probably not going to get the hip as narrow as I need it to be, because that's going to mess up my grain lines. So I'm just going to move it in enough, and I can keep my grain lines hopefully as straight as possible. And then I'm just going to tape it down. Okay, so this is probably kind of hard to see, but this is my seam line that I moved in and taped down, and then I cut away the excess. So as you can see, it's pretty straight, pretty straight. So that's all the alterations that I need to make. So now I've got this fabric, which is it's denim like. It's a little bit lighter than denim. I do have some denim that I'm going to be using once I try it out with this fabric first. So I figured if I make some pants and hopefully they turn out nice. All right, so these are my finished jeans. And I have my headscarf on and no more social distance because we're in the midst of the whole coronavirus epidemic. So I'm at home working on some jeans. So thinking that maybe eventually I'll be able to get out of the house. Um, but these are my finished jeans, and unfortunately there's still way too much room in the waist. I don't know how I don't know. I didn't account for this pattern, and maybe I didn't make the correct waist measurements. The other problem is there's too much room in the waist, but there's not enough room in the hips. So as you can see here, I don't have too much junk in my trunk, but the problem is it's just too tight. And this is a button fly. So you can see here, this is a button fly. And I don't know if you can tell, but there's like a gap on the sides. So you can see right inside here. And I think that's because there's just so much room right here. So, I mean, this is much closer than I got before. I'm gonna try it again with this pattern and make sure that I don't take as much off in the hips as I did before, and definitely take some more in the waist. But other than that, I don't know. You guys, oh, and this part right here, this is the selvage. I thought it wouldn't show, but it does. But that's what's going on right here. So you guys just let me know what you think. So I don't know, y'all. It's not a total failure, but it's not a total success either. Thank goodness these are just some muslin, well, wearable muslin denim type material. So next thing I'll do is just kind of reconfigure the pattern a little bit, and then just try it again. So
Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next week.